December 14th, 1812, the Niemen River, Poland. A Prussian general stands at the crossing point, counting what remains of the largest army ever assembled in European history. 6 months ago, 685,000 men marched east across this same river. French, German, Italian, Polish, Dutch, Swiss, Croatian, Portuguese. They crossed with flags flying, drums beating, confident they would force the Russian Empire to its knees within weeks. Now the general watches them return. Fewer than 10,000 soldiers capable of fighting stumble across the frozen river. Their uniforms are rags. Their faces are blackened with frostbite. Their eyes are hollow, distant, the eyes of men who have seen hell. Behind them, over the following days, another 30,000 stragglers crawl westward. They are skeletal. Many are barefoot, feet wrapped in strips of cloth or simply frozen black. Some are missing fingers, hands, noses, lost to the cold. They move in silence. No drums, no songs, just the crunch of snow and the rasping of breath. The rest, over 600,000 men, are dead. They lie frozen in snowdrifts along 1,000 kilometers of Russian wasteland. They float face down in the Berezina River. They rot in mass graves outside Smolensk, Vitebsk, Borodino. They were killed by cold, by starvation, by disease, by Cossack lances, by Russian muskets, by their own desperation. Entire regiments that entered Russia with thousands of men returned with dozens. Some units ceased to exist entirely. This is the story of the greatest military disaster in history before the World Wars. This is the story of Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia and how an empire's ambition was shattered against the vastness of the Russian winter. But here's what most people don't know. It wasn't just the winter that destroyed the Grande Armée. The catastrophe was already unfolding in the summer heat, months before the first snow fell. The decisions that doomed 600,000 men were made in palaces and on battlefields, driven by pride, miscalculation, and a fatal underestimation of an enemy's will. To understand how it ended in frozen horror, we must go back to where it began, at the height of Napoleon's power, when the world seemed to bend to his will. The French Empire controls the continent, from the Atlantic coast to the Russian border, from Hamburg to Rome, from the Netherlands to Naples. 70 million people live under Napoleon Bonaparte's direct or indirect rule. It is the largest European empire since Charlemagne, and it was built in barely 15 years by a man born into minor Corsican nobility. Napoleon's rise defies probability. General at 24, first consul at 30, emperor at 35, placing the crown on his own head in Notre Dame Cathedral while Pope Pius VII watched in silence. The symbolism was deliberate. Napoleon bowed to no one, not even God's representative on earth. His military record justifies the arrogance. At Austerlitz in 1805, he crushed the combined armies of Austria and Russia so thoroughly that the Austrian emperor sued for peace within days. At Jena Auerstedt in 1806, he annihilated the Prussian military machine in a single afternoon. The same Prussian army that had terrified Europe under Frederick the Great. At Wagram in 1809, he defeated Austria again, forcing them into alliance through marriage to Archduchess Marie Louise. Coalition after coalition formed against him. Coalition after coalition shattered. By 1811, there are no major continental powers willing to challenge France on the battlefield, except one. The relationship with Russia was complicated, built on an alliance that both emperors knew was temporary. In 1807, after defeating Russia at Friedland, Napoleon met Tsar Alexander I on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. The location was neutral ground, neither French nor Russian soil. They talked for hours. Witnesses reported they emerged embracing like brothers, having divided Eastern Europe between them. The Treaty of Tilsit formalized what became known as the Peace of the Two Emperors. It lasted 3 years. The problem was Britain. Britain controlled the seas. Napoleon controlled the land. Neither could strike the decisive blow against the other. The English Channel was too narrow to allow French invasion fleets to cross undetected, and too well defended to force. After the disaster at Trafalgar in 1805, when Admiral Nelson annihilated the combined French-Spanish fleet, Napoleon abandoned plans to invade Britain directly. Instead, he created the Continental System in 1806, a total economic blockade. Every European nation under French influence was forbidden from treating with Britain. The strategy was strangulation. Deny Britain its markets, collapse its economy, force it to negotiate from weakness. It required total compliance across the entire continent. Russia agreed at Tilsit. For 3 years, Russian ports were closed to British goods. But by 1810, the Russian economy was hemorrhaging. Russia's wealth came from exports, grain, timber, naval stores. Britain was the primary market. Without British trade, Russian grain rotted in warehouses. The nobility, whose fortunes depended on agricultural exports, grew restless. Tsar Alexander faced pressure from his own court. Lift the blockade or face internal revolt. In late 1810, Russian ports quietly began admitting British ships again. Napoleon knew immediately. His spies reported every violation. He sent diplomatic protests. Alexander replied with vague promises and continued opening Russian trade. Then Napoleon made it personal. In December 1810, he annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, a small German state ruled by Duke Peter, who happened to be Tsar Alexander's uncle. Napoleon didn't even bother with a pretext. He simply declared Oldenburg part of France and evicted the Duke. Alexander took it as the insult it was intended to be. By early 1811, both empires were preparing for war they hadn't yet declared. French troops began concentrating in the Duchy of Warsaw, the Polish puppet state Napoleon had created from Prussian and Austrian territories. Russian armies moved to the western frontier. Diplomatic letters grew colder, then stopped entirely. Both emperors issued ultimatums the other ignored. Napoleon faced a choice: accept Russian defiance of the continental system or enforce compliance through war. Acceptance was impossible. If Russia broke the blockade with impunity, other nations would follow. The entire strategy against Britain would collapse. Napoleon's authority, built on the principle that his word was law across Europe, would be exposed as hollow. But war with Russia was not like war with Austria or Prussia. Russia was vast. His marshals knew it. His ministers knew it. Charles XII of Sweden had invaded Russia a century earlier with 40,000 men and returned with barely 4,000. The Swedish king, once considered the greatest military mind in Europe, died in exile, broken by the Russian winter and scorched earth. Napoleon's advisors raised the comparison. He dismissed it. Charles XII was reckless, he argued. Napoleon was methodical. Charles XII had inadequate supplies. Napoleon would stockpile for months. Charles XII underestimated Russian resilience. Napoleon would bring such overwhelming force that resistance would be futile. Most critically, Napoleon believed this would not be a war of conquest. It would be a punitive expedition, a limited campaign to force Tsar Alexander back to the negotiating table. March to the frontier, destroy the Russian armies in 1 or 2 decisive battles, threaten Moscow or St. Petersburg, dictate terms, and return home before winter. 6 months, 8 at most. The same strategy had worked against every other opponent. There was no reason to think Russia would be different. In late 1811, Napoleon made his decision. Orders went out across the empire. Prepare for the largest military mobilization in history. The target? Russia. The objective? Submission. The timeline? 1812. What he didn't know, what he couldn't conceive, was that Tsar Alexander had already decided he would never negotiate. Not after the first battle, not after the 10th, not if Napoleon reached Moscow itself. 2 emperors, both convinced they could not back down, were about to collide, and 600,000 men were about to pay the price. The assembly began in winter and continued through spring across the French Empire and its satellite states. Conscription orders arrived in every province, from the barracks of Paris to the villages of Bavaria, from the Italian peninsula to the Dutch lands. Men were pulled from farms, workshops, and homes. The empire had been at war for over a decade. There were few young men left who hadn't already served. Napoleon lowered the conscription age and raised it, pulling in teenagers and men in their 40s. This was not just a French army. It couldn't be. France alone couldn't field the numbers Napoleon demanded. From the Kingdom of Italy came 27,000 troops. From the Confederation of the Rhine, the collection of German states under French protection, came nearly 120,000. Bavarians, Saxons, Westphalians, and troops from smaller principalities. From the Duchy of Warsaw came 95,000 Poles fighting for the promise of a restored Polish nation. From Austria, technically an ally through Napoleon's marriage, came 30,000 men commanded by Prince Schwarzenberg, though their commitment was questionable. From Prussia, defeated and humiliated in 1806, came 20,000 men forced into alliance against their will. Even smaller contributions arrived: Dutch, Swiss, Croatian, Portuguese, Spanish. By June 1812, the force assembled along the Niemen River exceeded 685,000 men. To put that in context, this was larger than the entire population of most European cities. It was more men than had fought in any single campaign in European history. The logistics alone were staggering. Napoleon spent months planning the supply system. Massive depots were established in East Prussia and Poland. Danzig, Königsberg, and Warsaw became gigantic warehouses packed with grain, ammunition, medical supplies, and fodder. Some 250,000 horses were assembled, both for cavalry and to pull the wagon trains. Portable ovens were constructed to bake bread on the march. Engineers prepared pontoon bridges to cross rivers. Mobile hospitals were organized. The preparation was meticulous. Napoleon had always excelled at logistics. It was one of the keys to his success, moving armies faster and keeping them supplied better than his opponents could manage. The army was organized into 3 main groups. The center, commanded by Napoleon himself, numbered approximately 450,000 men and would drive directly toward Moscow. The northern wing, under Marshal MacDonald, about 32,000 men, would advance toward St. Petersburg, threatening Russia's western capital. The southern wing, under Prince Schwarzenberg, about 34,000 Austrians, would guard the right flank and tie down Russian forces in Ukraine. By mid-June 1812, the entire force assembled along the Niemen River, the border between the Duchy of Warsaw and the Russian Empire. On the opposite bank, silence. Russian patrols had withdrawn. No shots were fired. The frontier was empty. June 23, 1812. Evening. The first French units began crossing the Niemen on pontoon bridges near Kaunas. Engineers had worked through the night to position the floating bridges across the river. Infantry crossed in columns, boots thundering on the wooden planks. Cavalry followed, horses nervous at the swaying beneath their hooves. Then artillery, the heavy guns dragged by teams of horses, the pontoons groaning under the weight. Napoleon himself crossed on June 24th, riding with the Imperial Guard, his elite veterans, the core of every major victory. Witnesses recorded that the crossing took 4 full days at all designated points. The tramping of hundreds of thousands of boots made the ground shake. Dust clouds rose so thick they darkened the sky. Local Lithuanians watched from a distance, terrified and awed. Once across, Napoleon issued a proclamation to the Grande Armée. "Soldiers, the Second Polish War has begun. The first ended at Friedland and Tilsit. At Tilsit, Russia swore eternal alliance with France and war with England. She now breaks her oath. Russia is drawn onward by fate. Her destiny must be fulfilled." The soldiers cheered. Many of them believed this would be over quickly. Russia would offer battle, Napoleon would win, as he always won, and they would be back in their garrisons by autumn. The march east began. Almost immediately, problems emerged. The roads of Lithuania and Poland were not like the paved highways of France or the maintained routes of Germany. They were dirt tracks that turned into rivers of mud after rain. The summer of 1812 brought heavy storms in the first weeks. The primitive roads became nearly impassable. Wagons sank axle deep. Artillery pieces had to be manhandled through the muck by dozens of men. Traffic jams stretched for kilometers as units bottlenecked at river crossings and narrow passes. The supply system, so carefully planned, began breaking down within days. Supplies that were supposed to move forward by wagon sat stranded in depots because the roads couldn't handle the traffic. The army was advancing faster than the logistics could support. Commanders started implementing Napoleon's traditional strategy: live off the land. Foraging parties scoured the countryside for food, fodder, and supplies. But Lithuania and Poland were not the rich farmlands of Germany or Italy. The population density was lower, villages were smaller and poorer. There simply wasn't enough food to sustain an army of 685,000 men and 250,000 horses passing through. Soldiers began going hungry, not starving yet, but eating half rations, then quarter rations. The horses had it worse. Horses require enormous amounts of fodder, around 20 pounds per day for a cavalry mount, more for draft horses pulling artillery in wagons. The countryside couldn't provide it. Horses began weakening, then collapsing. Within the first week, hundreds were dying daily. Within 2 weeks, thousands of dead horses lined the roads. The army marched past rotting carcasses that bloated in the summer heat, attracting clouds of flies. The stench became unbearable. Without horses, wagons were abandoned. Without wagons, supplies couldn't move forward. Without supplies, soldiers starved. And then, disease arrived. Typhus broke out first, spread by lice in the unwashed uniforms, in the cramped quarters where men slept pressed together. Then dysentery from contaminated water sources. Soldiers drank from streams and rivers polluted by the hundreds of thousands of men and animals passing through. Within days of drinking, they developed violent diarrhea. Dehydration killed many. Weakness incapacitated more. By the end of June, less than a week into the campaign, the Grand Army's medical services were overwhelmed, field hospitals filled with men too sick to march. Officers faced a grim choice: leave the sick behind to recover and likely be captured or die, or slow the entire army's advance. Most were left behind. The pace of advance was brutal. Napoleon was pursuing the Russian armies, trying to force them into battle before they could escape deeper into Russia. Units marched 30, sometimes 40 kilometers per day in summer heat. Men collapsed from exhaustion and heat stroke. More were left by the roadside. Desertion began. First a trickle, then a steady stream. Men from the satellite states, Poles, Germans, Italians, saw their friends dying of disease and starvation before a single battle had been fought. Some slipped away at night, others simply stopped marching and let the columns pass them by. By mid-July, the Grand Army had advanced roughly 300 kilometers into Russia. They had not yet fought a major battle, and they had already lost over 130,000 men, nearly 20% of the force that crossed the Niemen. Dead from disease, dead from starvation, dead from exhaustion, deserted, straggling, left behind in hospitals. The army bleeding out before the war had truly begun. Napoleon knew the numbers. His staff reported the losses daily, but he remained confident. The Russians were ahead of him, withdrawing eastward. When he caught them, he would destroy them in battle, as he had destroyed the Austrians at Austerlitz, the Prussians at Jena. One decisive victory would end this. He just had to catch them. What he didn't yet understand was that the Russians had no intention of giving him the battle he wanted. Not yet. Not until they had chosen the ground, not until the Grand Army had bled itself to the point where victory, even if Napoleon won the field, would be hollow. The trap was already closing. Napoleon just couldn't see it yet. For the first time since crossing the Niemen, Napoleon seriously considered stopping the campaign. His marshals gathered in his headquarters, a commandeered mansion in Vitebsk. Maps covered the tables. The discussion was blunt. Marshal Davout, his most trusted subordinate, laid out the numbers. Of the 450,000 men in the main Central Army group, fewer than 200,000 were combat-ready. Disease, desertion, and starvation had consumed the rest in 5 weeks. Marshal Berthier, his chief of staff, raised the supply situation. Depots in Poland were failing to push supplies forward. The army was already on half rations. Horses were dying faster than they could be replaced. Marshal Ney, always aggressive, argued for pressing forward. The Russians were running. One more push would force them to fight. Napoleon listened, staring at the map. Moscow was marked in the distance, hundreds of kilometers deeper into Russia. St. Petersburg to the north, both tantalizingly close and impossibly far given the state of his army. He could halt here, consolidate, fortify Vitebsk and the surrounding region, spend the winter resupplying and reorganizing, resume the campaign in spring 1813 with fresh troops and full magazines. It was the rational choice. On August 16th, near the city of Smolensk, the French advanced guard finally caught a substantial Russian force, Bagration's Second Army, which was attempting to link with Barclay's First Army inside the city. Napoleon saw his chance. If he could take Smolensk quickly and trap Bagration before the armies united, he could destroy half the Russian force. He ordered an immediate assault. The Battle of Smolensk lasted 2 days. French artillery bombarded the old walls of the city while infantry assaulted from 3 sides. Russian defenders held the walls desperately, buying time for Bagration to escape eastward. Buildings burned. The city's wooden structures ignited under cannon fire. By the second day, Smolensk was an inferno. On August 18th, the Russians evacuated under cover of darkness, blowing up ammunition stores as they left. The French entered a burning ruin. Napoleon stood in the charred wreckage and declared victory, but the Russian armies, now finally united under joint command, had escaped again. They were retreating toward Moscow. French casualties at Smolensk, approximately 10,000. Russian casualties, approximately 14,000. And the city itself was ash. No supplies, no shelter, nothing to sustain the army. The Grande Armée left Smolensk and continued east. By early September, Napoleon's central force had been reduced to approximately 160,000 combat-effective troops. Read that again. He had crossed the Niemen with 450,000 men in the main army. In 10 weeks, disease, starvation, desertion, and relatively minor combat had consumed nearly 2/3 of his force. And he still hadn't fought the decisive battle he needed. His officers were now openly questioning the campaign. Marshal Murat, commanding the cavalry advance guard, reported his horses were so weak they could barely trot. Marshal Davout warned that the army could not sustain another month at this pace. Even Marshal Ney, the most aggressive of Napoleon's subordinates, privately admitted the situation was dire. But Moscow was ahead. Moscow, the ancient capital. Moscow, the heart of Russia. Moscow, with its supplies and shelter and symbolic weight. If Napoleon took Moscow, Tsar Alexander would have to negotiate. No ruler could allow his capital to fall without suing for peace. It had never happened. The loss of a capital meant the end of resistance. Napoleon convinced himself this was true. On September 5th, French scouts reported Russian forces had stopped retreating. They were digging in near a village called Borodino, about 125 kilometers west of Moscow. Finally, the Russians were going to fight. Napoleon rode forward to observe the Russian positions personally. Through his telescope, he could see earthwork fortifications being constructed on low ridges, artillery batteries positioned on high ground. Russian defenders held the walls desperately, buying time for Bagration to escape eastward. Buildings burned. The city's wooden structures ignited under cannon fire. By the second day, Smolensk was an inferno. On August 18th, the Russians evacuated under cover of darkness, blowing up ammunition stores as they left. The French entered a burning ruin. Napoleon stood in the charred wreckage and declared victory. But the Russian armies, now finally united under joint command, had escaped again. They were retreating toward Moscow. French casualties at Smolensk, approximately 10,000. Russian casualties, approximately 14,000. And the city itself was ash. No supplies, no shelter, nothing to sustain the army. September 7th, dawn. 135,000 Russian soldiers stood in defensive positions across rolling hills and forest ridges. They had spent 2 days digging earthwork fortifications, flèches, angular dirt walls reinforced with timber, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. At the center of the line rose the Great Redoubt on Raevsky Hill, a massive earthwork battery holding 18 heavy cannon. Commanding them was General Mikhail Kutuzov, newly appointed after Tsar Alexander finally bowed to political pressure and removed Barclay. Kutuzov was 67 years old, fat, missing an eye from an old wound given to falling asleep during planning meetings. The court loved him because he was Russian, not a Baltic foreigner. Soldiers loved him because he had survived 50 years of war and still led from the front. He hadn't wanted this battle. He agreed with Barclay's strategy: retreat, let space and time destroy the French. But the Tsar, the nobility, and his own officers demanded a stand. So Kutuzov chose the ground carefully, defensive positions that would maximize Russian artillery and minimize French maneuverability. Opposite them, 130,000 French and Allied troops prepared to attack. They had 587 cannon. Napoleon had established his command post on a low hill with clear sightlines to the battlefield. At 6 a.m., he gave the order. The French guns opened fire. Over 500 cannons fired simultaneously. The sound was a physical force that shook the ground. Smoke erupted in massive clouds. Cannonballs screamed through the air and crashed into Russian positions, tearing through earthworks and men with equal indifference. The Russian batteries answered, another 600+ guns firing. The world became noise and smoke and iron. This was the Napoleonic era's version of industrial slaughter. Artillery could fire 2 to 3 rounds per minute. Solid shot, iron cannonballs could punch through multiple men in a row. At closer range, canister shot turned cannon into giant shotguns, spraying hundreds of metal balls that shredded entire formations. Explosive shells burst above or among infantry, scattering shrapnel. After an hour of bombardment, Napoleon sent in the infantry. French columns, masses of men in tight formation, advanced toward the Russian flèches on the left of the line. These were the fortifications held by Bagration and his corps. They were to take them, collapse the Russian left, and roll up the entire position. The columns marched forward through smoke so thick they could barely see 20 meters ahead. Russian artillery switched to canister. The effect was immediate and horrific. Men in the front ranks were simply erased, heads, torsos, limbs disappearing in sprays of blood. Those behind stepped over the bodies and kept marching. They reached the flèches and assaulted with bayonets. Russian defenders fired muskets point blank, then met the French with bayonets of their own. Men stabbed, clubbed, and strangled each other in the confined earthworks. The fighting was hand-to-hand, desperate, savage. The French took the flèches, Russian reserves counterattacked and retook them. The French assaulted again. The flèches changed hands 3 times in 2 hours. Bodies piled so high inside the earthworks that men had to climb over corpses to fight. General Bagration, commanding the defense, was hit by shrapnel that tore into his leg. He refused to leave the field, rallying his men from horseback, even as blood soaked through his uniform. Finally, blood loss forced him to be carried away. He would die of the wound weeks later, but his men held. The flèches were eventually taken by the French, but at a cost that staggered even hardened veterans. Entire battalions were destroyed. Regimental commanders died leading charges. Colonels fell. Majors took command and died minutes later. Captains led companies until they too were killed. Marshal Ney, commanding one of the assaulting corps, had his horse shot out from under him, then another, then a third. He continued on foot, sword in hand, leading his men forward through the smoke and fire. While the flèches were being contested, the center of the battlefield became a horror of its own. The great redoubt on Raevsky Hill was the key to the Russian position. Whoever held it controlled the battlefield. Napoleon ordered a massive assault. French heavy cavalry, cuirassiers, in steel breastplates and helmets, formed up for the charge. These were shock troops designed to smash through defensive lines by sheer weight and speed. Behind them, infantry prepared to exploit the breach. At 6 a.m., the cuirassiers charged. Imagine it. Thousands of armored men on massive horses moving from trot to canter to gallop, lances and sabers leveled, the ground shaking beneath the hooves, the sound like continuous thunder. The Russian artillery opened fire with canister at 200 meters. Horses and men went down in heaps, tumbling and screaming. The charge barely slowed. At 100 meters, Russian infantry fired massed musket volleys. More cavalrymen fell. The survivors crashed into the Russian lines. For a few minutes, the cuirassiers broke through. They reached the Great Redoubt, sabering gunners and driving Russian infantry back. French infantry rushed forward to support. Then Russian reserves, Cossack cavalry and line infantry counterattacked. The French were driven out. The redoubt remained in Russian hands. Napoleon's subordinate, General Caulaincourt, his master of horse and a personal friend, led another cavalry charge at the Great Redoubt an hour later. He reached the earthworks, fighting hand-to-hand with Russian soldiers. A bayonet took him in the chest. He died instantly. Napoleon received the news without visible reaction. He called for another assault. By noon, the Great Redoubt had been assaulted 4 times. French casualties were mounting catastrophically, but so were Russian losses. Both sides were feeding men into the grinder, neither willing to yield. At 2 p.m., a coordinated French assault, infantry, cavalry, and massed artillery finally overwhelmed the Great Redoubt's defenders. French troops seized the position and turned the Russian guns around, firing into the Russian rear. The Russian center buckled. For a moment, it looked like the entire line might collapse. Kutuzov, watching from his command post, committed his last reserves. Columns of Russian infantry and cavalry counterattacked toward the redoubt, trying to retake it. The fighting on and around Raevsky Hill became apocalyptic. Artillery from both sides fired into the melee, killing their own men along with the enemy. Cavalry charged and countercharged. Infantry formations dissolved into mobs of men stabbing and shooting at anything that moved. The hill was carpeted with bodies, French and Russian, so intermixed that in the smoke it was impossible to tell the lines apart. And then something strange happened. Napoleon, watching from his command post, had one force remaining that he had not yet committed: the Imperial Guard, his elite reserves, 20,000 strong, the best troops in the Grande Armée, veterans of a dozen campaigns, fiercely loyal, supremely trained. His marshals begged him to send them in. Marshal Ney wrote to Napoleon personally, "Give me the Guard and I will take the entire Russian army." Napoleon refused. Historians still debate why. He was ill, suffering from a severe cold, possibly a bladder or urinary infection that left him in constant pain and difficulty. He seemed strangely passive throughout the battle, issuing orders mechanically but without the fire and intuition that had won him so many previous victories. Some argue he knew, on some level, that even if he destroyed the Russian army here, he had no reserves left for what came after. Some argue he was simply too sick to think clearly. Some argue it was caution born from knowing how far he was from France, how weak his army already was. Whatever the reason, the Imperial Guard did not attack. The decisive blow was never delivered. By 6 p.m., after 12 hours of continuous slaughter, the guns began to fall silent. The Russian army, battered, bleeding, with entire divisions shattered, withdrew in relatively good order towards Moscow under cover of darkness and smoke. Kutuzov recognized he could not hold the field another day, but his army was intact enough to retreat. The French held the battlefield. Technically, this was a victory. Napoleon issued a bulletin declaring a great triumph. The cost: French and Allied casualties, approximately 30,000 killed and wounded. Russian casualties, approximately 45,000 killed and wounded. Combined, that's more than 70,000 men became casualties in a single day. To put that in context, that's more casualties than the Americans suffered in the entire Revolutionary War, in one day. The battlefield was a vision of hell. Bodies lay in heaps, especially around the flèches and the Great Redoubt. Wounded men screamed for water, for help, for death. The cries continued through the night. Medical services on both sides were completely overwhelmed. Men with survivable wounds bled out waiting for treatment. Those with serious wounds were simply left to die. Soldiers walked through the carnage in a daze. Some wept, some vomited. Veterans of Austerlitz and Jena said they had never witnessed anything like Borodino. Marshal Ney, surveying the field, was asked if it was a victory. He replied, "Victory? This is a massacre, not a victory." Napoleon himself walked the battlefield the next morning. He saw the bodies stacked like cordwood. He saw the blood-soaked earth. He saw the wounded still dying in the September sun. He said nothing. Because despite the staggering casualties, despite holding the field, despite technically winning the battle, Napoleon had failed to achieve his objective. The Russian army still existed. It had not been destroyed. It had not surrendered. It had withdrawn, battered but intact, towards Moscow under cover of darkness and smoke. Kutuzov recognized he could not hold the field another day, but his army was intact enough to retreat. On September 14th, 7 days after Borodino, the French advanced guard entered Moscow. The city was empty. Marshal Murat, commanding the advanced cavalry, expected resistance. Barricades, artillery positions, street fighting. Instead, his scouts reported the city gates open and undefended. He rode forward cautiously with a squadron of hussars. The streets were empty. No soldiers, no civilians, no movement except shutters banging in the wind. The silence was unnatural for a city that normally held 270,000 people. Moscow stretched before them across hills above the Moskva River, a sprawling mass of wooden buildings, merchant quarters, Orthodox churches with golden domes and colorful onion spires, monasteries, palaces. At the center rose the Kremlin, ancient fortress walls of red brick, towers with peaked roofs, cathedrals with golden domes that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Murat's advanced guard entered the Kremlin through the Borovitsky Gate. No resistance. The gate stood open. Inside the walls, palace buildings, armories, cathedrals, treasure houses, all abandoned. Napoleon arrived hours later with the main body. He established headquarters in the Kremlin, taking the Tsar's own apartments. He sat at Alexander's desk, slept in Alexander's bed. The symbolism was deliberate, the conqueror occupying the seat of Russian power. He waited for a delegation. In every other European capital he had entered, Vienna, Berlin, Madrid, civic officials or nobles had come to offer surrender and negotiate terms. It was how these things worked. The army was defeated, the capital occupied, the government sued for peace. Napoleon waited through the afternoon. No one came. He waited through the evening. The city remained silent. His marshals began reporting what they found. The arsenals were empty, weapons and ammunition evacuated. The granaries were mostly bare, grain either removed or destroyed. Moscow's governor, Count Fyodor Rostopchin, had ordered the evacuation of the entire population. Those who couldn't leave on their own were marched out under guard. Only a few thousand remained, the very old, the very sick, criminals released from prisons. And the fire pumps were gone, every single one, removed from fire stations and destroyed. That detail should have warned them. That night, fires began. First report came at midnight, blazes in the merchant quarters south of the Kremlin, small at first. Officers sent patrols to investigate. By the time they arrived, entire blocks were burning. Then fires erupted in the northern districts, then the west, then everywhere at once. French soldiers tried to fight the flames, forming bucket brigades from the river, but without fire pumps, it was useless, and the fires kept multiplying faster than they could be contained. By dawn on September 15th, Moscow was an inferno. Governor Rostopchin had left detailed instructions before evacuating. Prisoners were released and armed with torches. Barrels of oil were distributed. Key buildings were to be set ablaze simultaneously once the French occupied the city. Moscow, built largely of wood, would burn like kindling. The calculation was brutal. Better to destroy Russia's ancient capital than let it sustain the French army through winter. The fires burned for 3 days. Winds whipped the flames into firestorms that jumped from district to district. Entire neighborhoods ignited in minutes. Wooden churches burned, their golden domes melting in the heat. Merchant warehouses full of goods, fabric, furniture, oil, spirits, exploded. The heat was so intense that iron gates glowed red. French soldiers, instead of resting after Borodino, fought for their lives against walls of flame. Some units were trapped in burning districts and had to abandon their positions, running through streets where buildings collapsed around them. Looters ransacking abandoned homes were caught by the fires and burned alive. Horses panicked and stampeded. Wagons full of wounded caught fire. Napoleon watched from the Kremlin. Ash fell like black snow. The sky turned orange, then red, then black with smoke. The roar of the flames was continuous, punctuated by explosions as buildings collapsed or powder stores ignited. On September 16th, flames reached the edge of the Kremlin itself. Napoleon was forced to evacuate temporarily to a palace outside the walls. He stood and watched Moscow burn, his face expressionless. When the fires finally exhausted themselves on September 18th, 3/4 of the city was gone. What remained was a landscape of ash and charred timbers. Blackened church walls stood like broken teeth. Smoke still rose from embers. The smell of burning wood and burned flesh hung in the air. Napoleon returned to the Kremlin and walked through the ruins. His soldiers were camped among the wreckage, trying to salvage what food and supplies survived. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough to sustain 100,000 men through winter. The psychological impact was crushing. Every previous enemy, Austria, Prussia, Spain, had negotiated once their capital fell. But Russia had burned Moscow rather than let it be used. This was beyond Napoleon's experience, beyond his calculations. He sent peace proposals to Tsar Alexander, multiple letters through different channels. He tried direct appeals. France and Russia had been allies. They could be allies again. He tried threats. The might of the French Empire demanded respect. He tried reasoning. Continued war served neither empire. Alexander, in St. Petersburg, received the letters and did not respond. Days passed, then weeks. Napoleon remained in Moscow, paralyzed by indecision. His marshals urged immediate retreat. It was late September. Winter would arrive soon. The army was in no condition to stay. But retreat without a treaty, without even acknowledgement from Alexander, meant admitting total failure. Marshal Berthier presented the numbers. The army had approximately 100,000 effective troops in and around Moscow. Supplies sufficient for perhaps 3 weeks. Horse cavalry was nearly gone, most mounts dead or dying. Artillery horses were starving. The men were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly ill. Marshal Murat argued they should retreat while they still could. The roads were passable, the weather still mild, the army still organized enough to fight if necessary. Napoleon kept waiting. Surely Alexander would respond. Surely this couldn't continue. Surely there would be negotiations. 5 weeks passed. By mid-October, snow was falling. Supplies were nearly exhausted. Soldiers were slaughtering the few remaining horses for meat. Disease was spreading through the crowded camps. And still, no word from St. Petersburg. On October 18th, Russian forces under General Kutuzov attacked a French outpost at Tarutino, south of Moscow. It was a small engagement, but it signaled that the Russian army, rebuilt and reinforced since Borodino, was no longer simply retreating. They were preparing to attack. Napoleon called a council of war that evening. His marshals gathered in the Kremlin. The discussion was short. They had to leave, now, before Russian forces cut the roads west, before winter made retreat impossible, before the army disintegrated completely. Napoleon issued the order on October 19th. The Grande Armée would withdraw from Moscow. He still believed they could retreat in good order, reach Smolensk, resupply from the depots there, winter in friendly territory. The campaign had failed, but the army could be saved. Next year, with reinforcements, they could try again. Every assumption in that plan was wrong. At 10 a.m. on October 19th, the retreat began. The army formed columns and marched southwest, hoping to retreat through southern territories that hadn't been devastated by the advance. The soldiers looked back at Moscow's ruins as they left. Some felt relief to be finally leaving the cursed city. Others felt dread at what lay ahead. They were right to be afraid. Within days, the retreat would transform from orderly withdrawal to nightmare. Within weeks, it would become the worst military disaster in history. The trap hadn't been Moscow. The trap was the 1,000 kilometers of Russian winter between Moscow and safety. And it was about to close. October 24th, 1812. 5 days into the retreat. The French advanced guard, pushing southwest toward Kaluga, collided with the Russian army at Maloya-Roslovets, a small town on the Lusha River. Kutuzov had positioned his forces to block the southern route. He wasn't going to let Napoleon retreat through untouched territory. The battle lasted all day. The town changed hands 8 times. Buildings burned. Streets ran with blood. By evening, the French technically held the town, but at a cost of 5,000 casualties against a reinforced, well-supplied Russian army. Napoleon rode forward to assess the situation personally. Through his telescope, he could see Russian forces in strong defensive positions beyond the town, waiting for him to attack again. He made the decision that sealed his army's fate. Turn north, back onto the main road through Smolensk. It was the same road they had advanced on, the same road already stripped of every resource, the same road littered with the dead from the advance. Now 100,000 men and what remained of the baggage train would have to retreat along it, finding food where there was none, through terrain the Russians knew perfectly. Marshal Murat protested. Marshal Ney argued for forcing through at Maloya-Roslovets, but Napoleon's nerve had broken. He would not risk another major battle with the army in its current state. The northward turn began on October 26th, and the weather turned with it. The first snow fell that night, light at first, then heavier. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Men who had marched through summer heat and autumn rain now faced winter with inadequate clothing. Here's what had happened to their equipment. After Borodino and the occupation of Moscow, soldiers had discarded their heavy packs to make room for loot. Gold candlesticks, silver plates, fine fabrics, icons stripped from churches, treasures that were worthless in the Russian wilderness, but which men carried anyway, hoping to sell them if they made it home. Greatcoats were abandoned as too heavy, extra boots discarded, field rations thrown away to make room for stolen goods. Now the temperature was dropping and they had no protection. The first men started freezing to death in early November. They would lie down to sleep around the campfires and simply not wake up. Others froze while walking, collapsing mid-step, dying where they fell. Frostbite took fingers, toes, noses, ears. Flesh turned white, then black. Amputation without anesthesia became routine. Many who survived the amputation died of infection days later. The horses died faster than the men. A horse requires massive amounts of fodder. There was none. The horses ate bark stripped from trees, then leather from harnesses, then nothing. They weakened, collapsed, and died by the thousands. Every dead horse meant an abandoned wagon. Every abandoned wagon meant lost supplies. Every lost supply meant more starvation. Artillery pieces were abandoned when the horses pulling them died. Cannon that had been dragged from France to Moscow were left in ditches. Ammunition wagons left behind. Within 2 weeks, the Grande Armée had lost the majority of its artillery. And then, the Cossacks appeared. Russian light cavalry, superb horsemen from the southern steppes, began shadowing the retreat. They didn't attack the main columns. They picked off stragglers. Any man who fell behind for any reason was dead. The Cossacks would ride down on isolated soldiers, spear them with lances, strip the bodies, and vanish. The retreat became a running horror where stopping meant death and continuing meant exhaustion. Men marched until they literally couldn't take another step, collapsed, and were left behind. The sounds of Cossack hoofbeats and screaming behind the column became constant. No one looked back. Looking back meant seeing friends being killed, and there was nothing anyone could do. Discipline began collapsing. Units that had maintained cohesion since the Niemen crossing started dissolving. Officers couldn't control their men. Soldiers became individuals concerned only with survival. They fought each other over scraps of food. They killed wounded comrades to steal their boots or coats. The veneer of civilization stripped away by hunger and cold. Russian peasant partisans added to the nightmare. These were not regular soldiers. They were villagers armed with axes, pitchforks, hunting muskets, people whose homes had been burned, whose livestock had been stolen, whose families had been killed by the French advance. They wanted revenge. They ambushed small French detachments. They attacked foraging parties. They crept into camps at night and slit throats. They captured soldiers and beat them to death, or burned them alive, or buried them in snow. The war had become savage on all sides. By early November, the Grande Armée was no longer an army. It was a mob of starving, freezing men stumbling westward, preyed upon from all sides. The temperature kept dropping, 10 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius at night. Men's breath froze into ice on their beards and uniforms. Eyelids froze shut. Fingers were too numb to hold weapons, so muskets were simply discarded. Men urinated blood from kidney failure caused by extreme cold. Hallucinations from starvation and hypothermia became common. Soldiers seeing phantom villages, phantom food, phantom rescuers. The dying helped the dying, and both perished together.
November 9th. The army reached Smolensk. This was supposed to be salvation, the city where supply depots had been established during the advance, magazines full of food, ammunition, clothing. The promise of resupply had kept men moving for the last 100 kilometers. They found the depots nearly empty. Corruption, mismanagement, and raids by partisans had gutted the supplies. What remained was nowhere near sufficient for 100,000 starving men. The warehouses were stormed by soldiers who broke discipline completely, fighting each other for moldy bread and rotten meat. Officers tried to restore order. Some soldiers were shot for looting. It didn't matter. Discipline was gone. The army stayed in Smolensk for 4 days, consuming what little was there. Then it had to move again. Russian forces were closing in from multiple directions. Stay, and they would be trapped and annihilated. On November 13th, the retreat from Smolensk began. What left that city was no longer recognizable as the Grande Armée. It was a ragged column of skeletal men in rags, many barefoot with feet wrapped in cloth or simply frozen black, shuffling westward without hope, driven only by the animal instinct to survive.
Marshal Ney commanded the rear guard, the last units covering the retreat, holding off pursuing Russian forces. His corps had entered Russia with 40,000 men. He now had perhaps 8,000. On November 15th, near the town of Krasnoy, Russian forces under General Kutuzov and General Miloradovich attempted to cut off the retreat entirely. For 3 days, Ney fought a desperate series of delaying actions. His troops, starving, exhausted, outnumbered, held critical positions just long enough for the main body to escape, then fell back to the next position. Russian artillery pounded them. Cossack cavalry charged repeatedly. Infantry assaults overran position after position. Ney's corps was being destroyed, but he bought time with blood. By November 17th, Ney was cut off from the main army with fewer than 2,000 survivors. Russian forces surrounded him and demanded surrender. He refused. That night, he led his men across the frozen Dnieper River under fire from Russian batteries on both banks. Men were hit and fell through the ice, drowning. Others were shot and fell where they stood. Ney himself carried the regimental eagle, leading from the front. On November 18th, he reached the main French column with approximately 900 men, barely 1/10 of what he'd started with at Krasnoy. Napoleon, who had assumed Ney was dead or captured, embraced him. "I have 300 millions in my treasury," he said, "and I would give them all for Marshal Ney." But money couldn't save them now. The temperature dropped further, 35 degrees below zero at night. Men literally froze solid while sleeping, their bodies found in the morning in sitting or crouching positions, frozen in place. The cold did things that seemed impossible. Musket barrels became so brittle they shattered. Metal buttons froze to flesh. Men who touched them with bare hands lost skin. Vodka froze solid in canteens. Spit froze before it hit the ground. And through it all, the Cossacks kept coming. Shadows in the snow, death on horseback, constant, relentless, merciless. By late November, the army had been reduced to approximately 40,000 armed soldiers capable of fighting, plus another 40,000 unarmed stragglers and camp followers, wives, servants, merchants who had followed the army, wounded who somehow kept moving. Ahead lay the Berezina River. Under normal circumstances, by late November, the river should have been frozen solid enough to cross on the ice. But a brief warming period had partially thawed it. The result was a 100-meter-wide channel of icy water flowing fast, filled with chunks of floating ice. The bridges had been destroyed by Russian forces days earlier, and 3 Russian armies were converging to trap Napoleon against the river. Admiral Chichagov with 30,000 men from the south, General Wittgenstein with 30,000 from the north, and Kutuzov's main force of 80,000 from the east. Over 140,000 Russian troops closing in on 80,000 exhausted, starving French trapped against an impassable river. This should have been the end. Total annihilation, the complete destruction of the Grande Armée and the capture of Napoleon himself. But the French had one final miracle left. General Jean-Baptiste Ebel commanded the army's Dutch Engineer Corps. He had 400 engineers and a handful of tools, axes, hammers, nails scavenged from abandoned villages. No proper bridging equipment, no pontoons. Just men and whatever materials they could find. On November 25th, Ebel's engineers began constructing 2 trestle bridges across the Berezina near the village of Studianka. They worked standing in the river. The water was chest-deep and near freezing. Chunks of ice flowed past, battering them. They drove wooden pilings into the riverbed using hammers and brute force. They laid crossbeams scavenged from dismantled village houses. They nailed planks across the beams to create a roadway.
Men died while working. Hypothermia killed them where they stood. They simply slumped forward into the water and were carried away by the current. Others were crushed by floating ice or structural collapses. Ebbe kept them working through the night by torchlight. By dawn on November 26th, two narrow, shaking bridges spanned the Berezina. The crossing began. 80,000 people funneled toward two wooden bridges barely wide enough for a single wagon. French soldiers crossed first to secure the far bank, then artillery, then wagons, then the mass of stragglers and camp followers. Russian artillery opened fire from across the river. Cannonballs crashed into the crowds waiting to cross. Shells exploded in the mass of humanity. Panic erupted. People pushed, shoved, trampled each other trying to reach the bridges. The bridges, overloaded and damaged by ice, collapsed. Engineers frantically made repairs while bodies floated downstream. The bridges reopened. The crossing continued. For 3 days, this horror continued. Marshals Udino and Victor commanded rear guards, fighting desperate battles on both sides of the river to hold off the converging Russian armies. Artillery duels raged. Cavalry charged and countercharged. Infantry formed squares and fired volleys until they ran out of ammunition, then fought with bayonets. On the eastern bank, the crowd waiting to cross grew increasingly panicked. Russian forces were closing in. Artillery fire was getting closer. People could hear the sounds of battle approaching. On the morning of November 29th, General Ebbe received orders from Napoleon: burn the bridges to prevent Russian pursuit. Thousands of stragglers were still on the eastern bank, mostly camp followers, wounded civilians. They screamed, they begged, they rushed toward the burning bridges, trying to cross even as the flames consumed the wood. Some tried to wade or swim across the icy river. They died within minutes in the freezing water. Others stood on the bank and were captured by the Russian forces arriving. Many were simply killed. The bridges burned completely. The crossing was over. Approximately 50,000 had made it across. The rest were dead or captured.
The army, what remained of it, staggered westward. On December 5th, Napoleon made his final decision. He left the army. Traveling in a sleigh with a small escort, he raced toward Paris. His stated reason, rumors of a coup attempt, the need to raise a new army before the European powers realized the extent of the disaster. The unstated reason, he was abandoning the men he had led into Russia. He left Marshal Murat in command and disappeared into the night. The remnants of the Grande Armée continued the retreat without him.
On December 14, 1812, the survivors crossed the Niemen River back into Poland. Prussian General York, commanding a Prussian corps in French service, counted them as they crossed. Fewer than 10,000 organized soldiers, perhaps another 30,000 starving, frostbitten, diseased wrecks who stumbled across over the following days. Of 685,000 men who had crossed into Russia 6 months earlier, fewer than 40,000 returned, capable of any service. The rest were dead, captured, deserted, missing. Gone. The greatest army ever assembled in European history had been annihilated. Not by a single battle, not by one decisive defeat, but by hunger, disease, cold, and the vastness of Russia itself. The retreat from Moscow to the Niemen, 1,000 kilometers of frozen hell, had consumed them completely. And the consequences were about to reshape Europe. The numbers tell a story that defies comprehension. 685,000 men crossed the Niemen River into Russia in June 1812. Fewer than 40,000 returned fit for service in December. That's a 94% casualty rate across 6 months. But raw numbers hide the texture of catastrophe. Let's break it down by what actually happened to them. Approximately 400,000 dead not in battle. Most never fired a shot in anger. They died of typhus in the first weeks, dysentery in the summer heat, starvation on the advance, freezing on the retreat. They died of infected wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical care. They died of exhaustion, simply lying down and never getting up. They died of gangrene from frostbite. They died drowning in the Berezina. They died with Cossack lances in their backs. Approximately 100,000 captured. Most were marched to prisoner camps in Siberia. Many died on the march there, another 1,000 kilometers through Russian winter. Those who survived the march faced years in brutal conditions. Of the 100,000 captured, fewer than 20,000 ever saw their homes again. Approximately 50,000 deserted during the campaign. Germans, Poles, Italians who saw their units disintegrating and slipped away to try to survive on their own. Most died anyway, hunted by partisans, killed by peasants, frozen in forests. Some made it home. Most didn't. The remaining 95,000 were invalided, scattered across Eastern Europe or died in hospitals in the months after. The material losses were equally catastrophic. Over 200,000 horses perished. These weren't just cavalry mounts, they were the transportation system of the entire army. Draft horses pulled artillery, ammunition wagons, supply trains, ambulances. Without horses, the army lost mobility, firepower, and logistics simultaneously. Nearly 1,000 artillery pieces were abandoned. Cannon that represented years of industrial production that had been dragged from France across Germany and Poland and into Russia, left in snowdrifts and ditches. The entire baggage train was lost. Everything. Field hospitals, portable forges, pontoon bridging equipment, engineering tools, paymaster chests, regimental records, officers' personal effects. Now look at specific units to understand what this meant on a human scale. The 18th Line Infantry Regiment entered Russia with 3,600 men, returned with 300. The 4th Line Regiment, 3,000 in, 200 out. The Württemberg Corps from southern Germany, 16,000 entered Russia, 500 returned. That's 96.7% casualties. The Westphalian Corps, 23,000 soldiers, fewer than 1,000 came home. The Italian Royal Guard ceased to exist entirely. Every single man killed, captured, or missing. The Portuguese Legion, 9,000 men, approximately 400 survived. 18 French generals were killed. 42 more were wounded or captured. These were Napoleon's trained senior commanders, irreplaceable men with decades of experience. Think about what that meant for the towns and villages they came from. A village in Bavaria sends 60 young men to war. 2 return. Every family has lost someone. Multiple families have lost everyone. The demographic impact is catastrophic. An entire generation of men gone. Who will work the farms? Who will continue the family lines? Who will care for the aging parents? This pattern repeated across Europe. German states were particularly devastated. Some lost nearly their entire military-age male population. The social and economic consequences would last for decades. For France itself, the disaster came on top of 20 years of near-constant warfare. The Revolutionary Wars, 1792 to 1802, had already consumed hundreds of thousands. The Napoleonic Wars added hundreds of thousands more. Now Russia had taken another 250,000 French soldiers. France was running out of men. Napoleon understood this immediately. That's why he abandoned the army in early December and raced back to Paris, not to escape danger. He'd faced danger before, but because he needed to control the narrative and begin conscription before his enemies realized how completely he'd been destroyed. He reached Paris on December 18, 1812. The same day, he issued his 29th bulletin, the official report of the Russian campaign. It was a masterpiece of propaganda and misdirection. The bulletin acknowledged losses, but blamed them entirely on the early and rigorous winter. It minimized the scale of the defeat. It emphasized French victories at Smolensk and Borodino. It portrayed the retreat as an orderly withdrawal forced by weather, not a catastrophic collapse. The famous final line, "The health of the emperor is never been better." The message, Napoleon was fine. The army had been defeated by weather. France remained strong. None of it was true, but it bought him time. Within weeks, Napoleon began issuing conscription orders. He lowered the draft age to 16. He called up the class of 1814 a year early. He recalled veterans who had been discharged. He demanded new contingents from Allied states. By spring 1813, barely 4 months after the Russian disaster, Napoleon had raised a new army of over 200,000 men. It was an astonishing achievement. It was also meaningless, because while Napoleon was rebuilding, Europe was rising against him. December 30th, 1812. Prussia. General Johann von Yorck, commanding the Prussian corps that had been forced to serve with the French, signed the Convention of Tauroggen with Russian representatives. Without authorization from his king, Yorck withdrew the Prussian corps from the French alliance and declared neutrality. It was an act of insubordination that could have resulted in his execution. Instead, it sparked a national uprising. The Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm III, had been a reluctant French ally since Prussia's humiliating defeat in 1806. Now, seeing the French army destroyed and his own general defecting, he made his choice. On February 28, 1813, Prussia formed an alliance with Russia. The Sixth Coalition was forming. Russia, having driven the French from their territory, didn't stop at the border. Kutuzov's armies pushed into Poland, then into Prussia. Tsar Alexander, who had seemed weak and indecisive in 1811, was now the liberator of Europe. Austria watched and calculated. Technically still allied to France through Napoleon's marriage to Archduchess Marine Louise, the Austrians had contributed troops to the Russian campaign but kept them deliberately uninvolved in major fighting. Now, with France weakened, Austria began secret negotiations with Russia and Prussia. Sweden joined the coalition under Crown Prince Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, formerly one of Napoleon's own marshals, who saw an opportunity to settle old scores and expand Swedish influence. Britain, which had been fighting France alone for years, poured money and weapons into the Continental Allies. By March 1813, Napoleon faced a coalition of Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and Britain, with Austria preparing to turn against him. He won battles that spring and summer, at Lutzen in May, and Bautzen later that month. French forces defeated Prussian and Russian armies. Napoleon's tactical genius hadn't abandoned him, but the victories were hollow. His new army was made up of teenage conscripts, not veterans. They fought bravely, but lacked experience. They won battles, but couldn't exploit victories because they lacked cavalry. The horses were dead in Russia. They took ground, but couldn't hold it because they lacked numbers to garrison territory. And every battle cost casualties Napoleon couldn't replace. The coalition could lose battles and rebuild. France could not. In August 1813, Austria joined the coalition. Napoleon now faced over 500,000 Allied troops converging on him from multiple directions.
October 16th to 19th, 1813, Leipzig. Napoleon, with approximately 190,000 troops, faced over 380,000 coalition soldiers. For 3 days, fighting raged around the city. Napoleon held his ground initially, but he was outnumbered 2-1 and eventually forced to retreat. During the withdrawal on October 19th, the single bridge across the Elster River was prematurely blown while thousands of French troops were still on the wrong side. They were captured or killed. Marshal Poniatowski drowned trying to swim his horse across. The retreat became a rout. French casualties at Leipzig, over 70,000 killed, wounded, or captured. The Confederation of the Rhine, Napoleon's alliance of German states, collapsed. Every German state began defecting to the coalition. Allied armies invaded France from the east. By January 1814, coalition forces were on French soil for the first time in 20 years. Napoleon fought a brilliant defensive campaign, winning small battles against isolated enemy columns. But the Allies kept coming. By March, they were approaching Paris. On March 31st, 1814, Paris surrendered to coalition forces. Napoleon's marshals, the men who had followed him for 15 years, told him it was over. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, said to his face, "The army will not march." On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated as Emperor of France. He was exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. The Bourbon monarchy was restored under Louis XVIII. The empire was finished. He would return for the 100 Days in 1815, only to be finally defeated at Waterloo. But that was epilogue. The true end of Napoleon's empire wasn't Waterloo. It was Russia. Everything that followed, Leipzig, the invasion of France, the abdication, was consequence flowing from the catastrophe of 1812. The moment Napoleon ordered his army across the Niemen, the sequence of events that would destroy him was set in motion. But here's the critical question that has echoed through 2 centuries. Why did it happen? The common answer is simple: winter. General Winter defeated Napoleon. The cold destroyed the Grande Armée. It's a comforting narrative. It removes human agency. It makes the disaster seem like an act of God, unavoidable and blameless. It's also wrong, and understanding why it's wrong teaches us far more than the comfortable myth ever could. The myth goes like this. Napoleon invaded Russia with the largest army ever assembled. He advanced successfully through summer and early autumn. Then winter arrived early and with unprecedented severity. The Russian winter, colder than anything the French had experienced, froze the army to death. If not for the unusual cold, Napoleon would have succeeded. Every part of this narrative is false or misleading. Let's dismantle it piece by piece. The logistics failure. The Grand Army was too large to supply. Period. Weather was irrelevant. An army of 685,000 men plus 200,000 horses requires staggering amounts of food and fodder daily. Historians estimate roughly 900 tons of food and 1,800 tons of fodder needed per day just to maintain basic operations. Napoleon's logistics system was based on 2 elements: pre-positioned supply depots and living off the land. It had worked brilliantly in Germany, Italy, and Austria, regions with dense populations, good roads, and productive agriculture. Russia was different. Population density was a fraction of Central Europe's. Roads were primitive dirt tracks that became impassable after rain. Agricultural surplus was minimal even in peacetime. The math simply didn't work. Even if the weather had been perfect, even if the Russians hadn't burned anything, there was not enough food in Lithuania and Western Russia to sustain 685,000 men moving through it. The army was starving by mid-July, in summer, months before winter. Soldiers were on reduced rations within 2 weeks of crossing the Niemen. Horses were dying in massive numbers from lack of fodder during the hottest part of the year. This wasn't weather. This was logistics failure that was baked into the campaign from the start. The disease catastrophe.
More men died of disease than cold. This is not speculation, it's documented in French medical records and officer reports. Typhus, spread by lice in unwashed uniforms and crowded camps, began killing soldiers in late June. Dysentery from contaminated water sources killed even more. By mid-August, before Moscow, before the retreat, before winter, the army had lost over 200,000 men, primarily to disease. French medical officers reported that disease casualties outnumbered combat casualties by at least 10 to 1 during the advance. The retreat worsened this because exhausted, starving men have weakened immune systems. But disease was devastating the army in summer. Winter didn't cause the typhus epidemic. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, lice-infested clothing, and the concentration of hundreds of thousands of men in unsanitary conditions caused it. The timeline failure. Napoleon started too late and stayed too long. The original plan called for invading in early May. Diplomatic delays and logistical problems pushed the start to late June, nearly 2 months late. Those 2 months were critical. Had Napoleon crossed the Niemen in early May, he would have had 5 months of good weather instead of 3. He might have forced a decisive battle by midsummer, occupied Moscow by August, and either negotiated peace or withdrawn by September. Instead, he crossed in late June, didn't reach Moscow until mid-September, and didn't begin the retreat until late October. The retreat began October 19th. The temperature that day was above freezing. The first snow fell on October 26th, light snow, not a blizzard. Temperatures didn't drop to truly killing cold, minus 20 degrees Celsius and below, until mid-November. But the army was already disintegrating before the severe cold hit. Why? Because they had already been starving for months. Because they had already lost most of their horses. Because they were already diseased and exhausted. Winter delivered the final blow, but the campaign was failing before winter arrived. The decision to stay in Moscow for 5 weeks waiting for negotiations that never came, that was Napoleon's choice, not winter's imposition. The Russian strategy. The scorched earth withdrawal was a deliberate Russian choice, not a natural disaster. Barclay de Tolly's strategy was controversial precisely because it was so calculated. Burn crops, drive livestock east, poison wells, leave nothing for the French. Retreat deeper into Russia's vast interior, stretching French supply lines to the breaking point. The burning of Moscow was ordered by Governor Rostopchin. Fire pumps were deliberately removed, prisoners were released and armed with torches. This was policy, not accident. Tsar Alexander's refusal to negotiate after Napoleon took Moscow was a choice. Every previous European monarch had sued for peace when their capital fell. Alexander refused. He was willing to sacrifice Moscow itself rather than submit. These were strategic decisions, exploiting geography and climate as weapons. But weapons must be wielded. They don't fire themselves. Russian commanders turned winter and distance into tactical advantages through conscious choice. The myth of unusual cold. The winter of 1812-1813 was cold, but not unusually so for Russia. Meteorological records from the period show temperatures within normal ranges for a Russian winter. Moscow typically sees temperatures of minus 10 degrees Celsius to minus 20 degrees Celsius in November and December. That's exactly what occurred in 1812. The French experienced it as unprecedented because most had never experienced a continental winter. Soldiers from France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, they came from temperate maritime climates. A French winter rarely drops below zero. An Italian winter is mild. Encountering minus 20 degrees Celsius felt apocalyptic to them. But for Russians, it was normal. Russian soldiers were equipped and acclimated for it.
French soldiers were not. This wasn't unusual weather. This was predictable Russian winter that Napoleon should have prepared for and didn't. The height-based factor. Napoleon underestimated Russian will and overestimated the decisiveness of battle. He assumed 1 or 2 victories would force negotiations, as they had with Austria after Austerlitz, with Prussia after Jena. He could not conceive that Alexander would refuse to negotiate after Borodino after the fall of Moscow. This was strategic blindness born from a decade of victories. Every opponent had eventually submitted. Why would Russia be different? The answer: because Russia could trade space for time in ways Austria and Prussia could not. Because Russian culture and autocratic government meant Alexander could ignore public pressure in ways constitutional monarchs could not. Because Russian Orthodox Christianity framed the war as holy resistance against a foreign invader. Napoleon didn't understand his opponent. That's not weather. That's strategic failure.
Here's the real sequence. The campaign was logistically unsustainable from day one. The army began dying of disease and starvation in summer. Russian scorched-earth strategy denied what little local supplies existed. Borodino was a Pyrrhic victory that solved nothing. The decision to occupy Moscow and wait for negotiations wasted 5 critical weeks. The retreat began too late, along a devastated route, with an army already weakened to the breaking point. Winter accelerated the collapse, but did not cause it. By the time severe cold arrived in mid-November, the army had already lost most of its horses, most of its artillery, its cohesion, and its discipline. The cold killed men who were already starving, diseased, and exhausted. It finished what logistics failure and disease had begun. Blaming winter is psychologically comforting. It removes human responsibility. It makes the disaster seem like an act of God, unavoidable, unforeseeable, blameless. It also served French propaganda purposes. Napoleon's 29th Bulletin explicitly blamed the early and rigorous winter, while minimizing strategic and logistical failures. It was easier for French pride to accept defeat by nature than defeat by Russia. The myth allows us to avoid confronting the real lessons, that overconfidence leads to catastrophic miscalculation, that logistics matter more than tactical brilliance, that underestimating your enemy is fatal, that knowing when to stop is as important as knowing when to start. Winter makes a better story than "the emperor ignored supply calculations and stayed too long." But history's job isn't to tell comfortable stories, it's to tell true ones. The 1812 campaign failed because Napoleon made a series of strategic errors, invading with an unsustainable force, pursuing an enemy who refused to fight on his terms, staying in Moscow waiting for negotiations that would never come, and retreating too late along a route that could not support his army. Winter was the context in which these errors became fatal, but context is not cause. 600,000 men died because their emperor miscalculated and refused to admit it until too late. That's the truth Winter's myth obscures, and it's the truth that has far more to teach us than any fairy tale about cold weather. This pattern repeats through history. Leaders intoxicated by past success, convinced the rules that apply to others don't apply to them, pushing beyond sustainable limits because they can't conceive of failure. Hitler invaded Russia in 1941 with explicit references to Napoleon, convinced he would succeed where Napoleon failed because German organization was superior. He failed worse, losing an entire army group at Stalingrad in conditions that eerily mirrored 1812. The American experience in Vietnam followed similar logic. Superior military force applied to achieve political objectives without understanding the enemy's will or the sustainability of the commitment. Tactical victories that meant nothing strategically. The lesson isn't, don't invade Russia in winter. The lesson is, understand your enemy, match means to ends, know your limits, and recognize when you're wrong before catastrophe becomes inevitable. Napoleon was one of history's great military geniuses. He transformed warfare, law, administration across Europe. His impact on the modern world is incalculable, and none of it saved him when he made the same mistake every failed conqueror makes, believing that will and brilliance can overcome fundamental strategic reality. 600,000 men paid the price for that mistake. They died in Russian fields and forests and rivers, far from home for objectives that were never achievable by the means employed. 2 centuries later, bones are still being found. Construction projects in Russia, Poland, Lithuania, they uncover mass graves with disturbing regularity. French belt buckles, corroded green, Russian buttons, musket balls, skeletal remains showing evidence of violent death, of disease, of frostbite severe enough to leave marks on bone. Museums across Europe preserve letters found on bodies, a French corporal writing to his mother that he hasn't eaten in 3 days, a Polish lancer describing watching his horse die, a German conscript from Bavaria saying he doesn't think he'll see home again. He didn't. These weren't soldiers in the abstract. They were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. They had lives they expected to return to, jobs, families, futures. Over 600,000 of them never came back. Think about that number in human terms. That's more than the entire population of most European cities in 1812. That's equivalent to killing every single person in Amsterdam or Lisbon or Naples. And for what? Napoleon gained nothing. After 6 months of campaign, hundreds of thousands dead, the largest army ever assembled destroyed, he ended up with exactly the same strategic position he'd started with, except weaker. Russia remained defiant. Britain remained unconquered. The continental system remained ineffective. Within 2 years, he lost everything else as well. Russia lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians, saw Moscow burned, vast territories devastated. But Russia survived and emerged as the dominant land power in Europe for the next 40 years. This isn't about winter. It's about what happens when ambition becomes untethered from reality. Napoleon built an empire through military genius and political brilliance, but he couldn't accept limits. Every victory convinced him the next victory was possible. Every enemy that submitted convinced him the next enemy would submit too. Russia was different, vast enough that space became a weapon, autocratic enough that Alexander could ignore pressure to negotiate, culturally resistant enough to burn Moscow rather than surrender. Napoleon couldn't see it because his experience told him all enemies were the same. The logistics failure was predictable. His own officers warned him. The supply calculations showed the army was too large. The timeline showed the start was too late. He ignored all of it because he'd always made the impossible work before. That's hubris, not the pride of arrogance, but the blindness of success. When you've redrawn the map of Europe, why would you believe Russia could stop you? The 1812 campaign is what happens when strategic vision loses contact with operational reality, when political objectives exceed military capability, when confidence becomes overconfidence. It's also what happens when you don't know when to stop. Napoleon could have halted at Vitebsk in July, could have wintered there, consolidated, resumed in 1813. He didn't. Could have left Moscow in September instead of waiting 5 weeks for negotiations that were never coming. He didn't. Could have accepted Metternich's terms in 1813 and kept France powerful. He didn't. Each decision, individually, made sense from his perspective. Together, they destroyed him. The lesson here, the real lesson that echoes across 2 centuries, is this: understand your enemy. Match means to ends. Know your limits. Recognize when you're wrong before catastrophe becomes inevitable. Leaders intoxicated by past success often convince themselves the rules that apply to others don't apply to them. They push beyond sustainable limits because they can't conceive of failure. Napoleon was one of history's great military geniuses. He transformed warfare, law, and administration across Europe. His impact on the modern world is incalculable. And none of it saved him when he made the fundamental mistake of believing that will and brilliance could overcome strategic reality. 600,000 men paid the price for that mistake. They died in Russian fields and forests and rivers, far from home, for objectives that were never achievable by the means employed. Their bones, still being discovered 2 centuries later, are history's way of insisting we remember. Not just that they died, but why. The ghosts of 1812 are still teaching, still warning, still showing us what happens when empire exceeds grasp. The only question is whether we're willing to listen. These men deserve to be more than a footnote about winter. They deserve to have their story told fully and honestly. They marched into Russia with hope, with duty, with loyalty to their emperor. They died in snow and mud and ice, abandoned by the man who led them there. The 600,000 who never came home deserve to be remembered. And more than that, they deserve to be understood. Because understanding what happened to them, understanding why it happened, might help us recognize the pattern before it repeats, might help us see when ambition has lost touch with reality, might help us know when to stop before catastrophe becomes inevitable. That's what history offers us, not comfortable myths about weather, but hard truths about human decision-making, about the consequences of pride, miscalculation, and the fatal underestimation of an enemy's will. The frozen hell of 1812 didn't have to happen. Every step toward disaster was a choice. Every choice made sense to the man making it. And every choice together led 600,000 men to their deaths. The bones in Russian soil are still speaking. The question is whether we're listening. If this story affected you, if it changed how you think about leadership, limits, or the cost of ambition, help it reach others. Like, comment, share. These 600,000 dead deserve to be more than a footnote about winter. I want to hear from you. What's the lesson you're taking from this? Where do you see this pattern of hubris and overreach playing out today? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone and respond to as many as I can. Subscribe if you want more history that matters. Stories that don't just tell you what happened, but force you to think about why it matters. The ghosts of 1812 are still teaching, still warning, still showing us what happens when empire exceeds grasp. The only question is whether we're willing to listen. These men deserve to be more than a footnote about winter. See you in the next one.